The gates slammed shut. Behind towering stone walls, thousands of terrified people watched thick black smoke rise from villages that had stood peacefully only days before. Church bells rang frantically across the city, warning of an enemy unlike any they had ever faced. Out on the sea, dozens of Viking longships drifted silently with the tide. Their dragon-headed prows cut through the water like predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the front of the fleet stood a man no one inside those walls had ever heard of. But before the sun set, his name would become one Europe would never forget. Most people know the name Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking whose reputation spread fear across kingdoms, the warrior who became the greatest legend of his age. But history holds a question few people ever ask. How do you become greater than a legend? Imagine spending your entire life living in the shadow of the most feared Viking in history. Every victory compared to his, every mistake judged against his, every person believing you would never escape his shadow. Most men would spend their lives trying to live up to that name. Bjorn did something far more dangerous. He decided to surpass it. This is not the story of Ragnar. This is the story of the son who sailed farther, fought harder, and became so feared that kingdoms trembled at the sight of his ships. This is the story of Bjorn Ironside. To the world, Ragnar Lothbrok was a legend, but to Bjorn, he was simply his father. A father whose name echoed through every hall in Scandinavia. Warriors spoke of his victories as though they were impossible myths. Skalds sang songs about him late into the night. Even kings measured themselves against the man who had turned Viking raids into legend. For everyone else, Ragnar inspired admiration. For Bjorn, he became the standard no son was ever expected to surpass. Every time Bjorn picked up a sword, someone remembered what Ragnar had done with one. Every time he stepped onto a ship, someone spoke about Ragnar's greatest voyages. Every success was compared. Every failure was magnified. Imagine growing up in a world where your own name meant almost nothing. You weren't Bjorn. You were Ragnar's son. But Bjorn wasn't the only one carrying that burden. Around him stood brothers just as ambitious. Ivar, whose brilliant mind made him as dangerous as any warrior. Ubba, determined to earn glory in battle. Halfdan and Vitsirk, each chasing a legacy of their own. This wasn't just a family, it was a battlefield. Not one fought with swords, but with reputation. Every victory brought one brother closer to becoming the next legend. Every defeat pushed another further into Ragnar's shadow. Bjorn understood something long before he became famous. If he followed the same path as his father, the world would never remember him. No matter how many villages he raided, no matter how many enemies he defeated, people would always say the same thing. He was good, but he wasn't Ragnar. That was the day Bjorn made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not spend his life chasing his father's legend. He would create one that belonged to him alone. The first step toward becoming a legend wasn't glory, it was survival. Long before kings feared his name, before songs were sung about his victories, before Europe learned to watch the horizon for Viking sails, Bjorn was just another young warrior standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had spent their entire lives at sea. On those ships, your family name meant nothing. The ocean did not care who your father was. Storms showed no respect for legends, and an enemy's sword could end your story just as quickly, whether you were a king's son or a farmer's son. Every raid was a lesson. Learn or die. Bjorn learned quickly. He studied coastlines before the ships reached land. He watched experienced warriors choose the perfect place to strike. He learned when to fight, when to retreat, and when patience could win a battle that strength alone could not. The medieval sources don't always agree on the details of these early years, but they tell us something even more important. Bjorn kept returning, raid after raid, battle after battle, while others disappeared into unmarked graves or were forgotten by history. Bjorn's reputation continued to grow. His men began trusting his decisions. Warriors followed his orders without hesitation, not because he was Ragnar's son, but because he kept bringing them home alive. That kind of respect couldn't be inherited. It had to be earned. Every successful voyage gave Bjorn something more valuable than gold. It gave him loyal warriors, and loyal warriors made impossible dreams seem possible. Soon, Bjorn no longer wanted to become another famous Viking. He wanted something far greater. He wanted to sail somewhere no Viking leader had ever dared to go, a place so rich, so powerful, that conquering even a single city would change his name forever. The Mediterranean. Every warrior dreams of becoming famous, but only a handful dare to chase the impossible. Bjorn had already earned the respect of his men. He had survived battles. He had built a reputation. But deep down, he knew something. If he spent the rest of his life raiding the same shores as every other Viking, he would always remain another great warrior, never a legend. Then he looked south, far beyond the familiar waters of England, beyond the rivers of Francia, beyond every coastline the Norse had come to know, lay a world overflowing with unimaginable wealth, the Mediterranean. To most Vikings, it may as well have been the edge of the world. Few had sailed there. Fewer still had returned. Yet the stories were impossible to ignore. Great cities built from stone, markets overflowing with gold and silk, churches filled with treasures collected over centuries, kingdoms so wealthy that a single successful raid could reward a man for life. But reaching those shores meant gambling everything. Once the fleet sailed beyond familiar waters, there would be no allies, no rescue, no safe harbors waiting ahead. If a storm destroyed the ships, they would simply disappear from history. Their families would never know what became of them. Their names would vanish with the sea. Imagine standing at the front of one of those longships, watching the coastline disappear behind you, knowing that every wave carried you farther from home than any Viking before you. Home disappearing behind the horizon, every wave carrying you farther from everyone you had ever known. Following one man because you believed he could take you where no Viking had gone before. That kind of loyalty isn't built with fear. It's earned through years of leading men home alive. According to the surviving accounts, Bjorn joined forces with the experienced Viking leader, Halstein. Together they assembled one of the most ambitious Viking expeditions of the age. Dozens of longships, hundreds of hardened warriors, not preparing for another raid, but for a journey that could take years, a journey that would either destroy them or make them immortal. The fleet pushed through the Strait of Gibraltar, leaving the Atlantic behind and entering a world unlike anything the Norse had ever seen. Every new coastline revealed another wealthy city. Every successful raid added more silver, more gold, and more confidence. Bjorn's gamble was working, but one prize stood above all the others. A city whispered about across Europe. Rich, powerful, protected by walls that seemed impossible to breach. According to later accounts, Bjorn believed it was Rome itself. Many modern historians believe the city was actually Luna, mistaken for Rome by the Vikings or by later storytellers. Whatever its true identity, to Bjorn and his men, it represented the greatest prize they had ever faced. There was only one problem: the walls. They were too high, too thick, too heavily defended. No matter how fearless the Vikings were, no army could simply smash its way inside. Days passed. The city remained sealed. Every gate was guarded. Every tower watched the sea. Then, Bjorn stopped thinking like a warrior. He started thinking like a strategist. According to the famous story preserved in later medieval accounts, a message was sent into the city. The feared Viking leader was dying. Before death claimed him, He wished to abandon his old gods, accept Christianity, and receive a Christian burial inside the city walls. To the defenders, it sounded like victory. Their greatest enemy was surrendering. The gates slowly opened. Priests stepped forward. Soldiers lowered their guard. A coffin carrying the dead Viking leader was lifted through the entrance. Everything had gone exactly as Bjorn hoped. Imagine the silence inside that coffin. Every heartbeat echoing in the darkness. Every step bringing him closer to the center of the city. One mistake, one suspicious guard, one loose movement, and the plan would end in execution. Then, the moment came. The coffin burst open. Bjorn leaped to his feet with sword in hand. Chaos exploded through the streets. The stunned defenders had opened their own gates to the very man they feared most. Whether every detail of this dramatic story happened exactly as later writers described remains uncertain. Medieval sagas often blended history with legend, but the tale survived for centuries because it captured something people believed about Bjorn, that when strength was not enough, he relied on boldness, deception, and the willingness to risk everything. That single story spread across Europe, and with every retelling, the legend of Bjorn Ironside grew even larger than the man himself. But legends are never forged without sacrifice. Every victory Bjorn celebrated had a cost. The Mediterranean had made him famous, but it had also tested his men beyond anything they had ever endured. Storms scattered the fleet, ships disappeared beneath towering waves. Warriors who had followed him across half the known world would never see Scandinavia again. Some fell in battle. Others vanished into the sea without a grave, their stories ending far from the families waiting for them at home. For those who survived, the journey home was every bit as dangerous as the journey south. They had sailed farther than almost any Viking fleet before them. Now they had to survive the impossible journey back. But when Bjorn finally returned, he was no longer simply Ragnar's son. He had become a legend in his own right. Yet while Bjorn's reputation continued to grow, tragedy struck his family. According to the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok met his end in Northumbria, captured by King Ella and thrown into a pit of venomous snakes. Whether every detail of that famous account happened exactly as described remains debated by historians. But one fact is undeniable. Ragnar's death changed the Viking world forever. Across Scandinavia, his sons were faced with a choice: accept the humiliation or answer it with war. Bjorn's brothers, especially Ivar, Halfdan, and Ubba, would become central figures in the campaign remembered as the Great Heathen Army, an invasion that reshaped the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. Bjorn's role in those events is far less certain than that of his brothers. Some historical traditions place him elsewhere, strengthening his own rule in Scandinavia rather than taking part in every campaign. That uncertainty tells us something important. While others sought revenge, Bjorn was building a kingdom. The fearless raider who had crossed the Mediterranean was becoming something even greater: a ruler. The sagas remember him as a king of Sweden, and later rulers would proudly claim descent from him. Think about what that means. A boy once introduced to the world as Ragnar's son had become the man future kings proudly called their ancestor. That is perhaps Bjorn's greatest victory. Not the cities he raided, not the treasure he carried home, not even the fear he inspired across Europe. His greatest achievement was escaping the shadow he was born into. He proved that a man is not remembered because of the name he inherits, but because of the legacy he leaves behind. More than 1,000 years have passed since Viking longships crossed Europe's seas. Their kingdoms have vanished. Their ships have rotted away. Even the great halls where warriors once celebrated their victories have long since turned to dust. Yet one name continues to survive: Bjorn Ironside. Historians still debate parts of his story. Was the city truly Rome or Luna? How much of the famous coffin story belongs to history, and how much belongs to legend? Those questions may never be answered with certainty, but perhaps they aren't the questions that matter most. The real question is this: how does the son of history's greatest Viking become a legend himself? The answer was never luck. It was courage, ambition, leadership, and the willingness to sail where even his father never dared to go. Ragnar gave Europe a legend. Bjorn proved legends could be surpassed. He didn't erase his father's shadow. He became great enough to cast one of his own. And perhaps that is why, more than 1,000 years later, we still speak his name.